We've learned that generally crimes require two components, an actus reus and a mental state or mens rea. Previously, in our prior lectures, we covered the first component of a crime. That is the actus reus of a crime, that action that must be committed to be legally sufficient. So no matter the crime, whether it's burglary or larceny or murder, the general principle is that there are two ways to prove an actus reus, either by a voluntary affirmative act over which our defendant has physical control, or by his failure to act, when he had a duty to act and that failure to act resulted in the harm. In this lecture, I want to turn our attention to the second component, generally required for guilt. That component is the defendant's mental state, or mens rea. A guilty mind, or mens rea, is generally regarded as an essential requirement for the imposition of criminal culpability. And you can imagine it wouldn't be fair to convict someone who did an act but did not have a culpable state of mind. Where would his blameworthiness come from? Generally, if one does an act without any culpable mental state, then she hasn't demonstrated the kind of mental state worthy of punishment. That's why in criminal law we're going to focus so extensively on the culpable state of mind that the prosecution has to prove. In this lecture, we're going to sample 3 different mental states. As we move through the course and examine individual crimes, we're going to focus more in depth on these and other mental states. But for now, let's just set the stage for our inquiry. Today we introduce the concept of mens rea with the following categories: crimes that require an intent, crimes that require criminal negligence, and those crimes we call strict liability crimes, crimes without any mental state or mens rea at all. So let's first start with intent. What is it to mean intent? Intent is the conscious desire to achieve a certain result. That's where our defendant doesn't act hoping for the consequences of that crime. Some crimes may only be ones that require the specific intent, in which case the prosecution has to prove the defendant wanted the consequences of that crime to take place. So we're going to focus on what the defendant said, what the defendant has done to help demonstrate his mental state. For crimes that require an intent, our focus is exclusively on what the defendant is thinking. We might look to the victim's mental state. We might look to the victim to say, did the victim feel afraid? Did the victim think the defendant was trying to rob him or steal from him? But what we're really looking at is we're looking at what the defendant wanted to do. So let's put this in context. Let's take the mens rea of intent to kill, which is required in certain crimes. Generally, the mens rea of intent to kill means the desire to cause the consequences of death. So how do we get there? Well, we can use both the acts and the statements of the defendant to help prove that intent to kill. So an obvious example would be if the actor says to his victim, "I'm going to kill you," and he puts a gun against the victim's head and he pulls the trigger. The trier of fact, usually the jury, sometimes the judge, can assume by watching that, understanding those were the facts, that the defendant intended the consequences of death. He intended to kill the victim. His statement showed it, and putting the gun to the victim's head showed it. But most times, it's not quite so obvious. That's when the prosecution needs to take all the facts together to shape the narrative, to prove and demonstrate to the jury that the defendant had the intent to kill.